Hey everybody, hope you're keeping safe. Hope you are socially distancing from everyone. Today I want to teach you how to read and humorously, here's how you read the Bible. Of course not. There are so many different ways that one can approach a sacred text and how to read it. So I like to try to keep this under 10 minutes, so I'm just going to talk to you about two. One's kind of like the really interesting, takeaway, and the next one's going to be a setup for the next podcast. As you know, there's different ways to approach the Bible. And scholars usually take what's called a biblical criticism approach. Criticism should not be implied with an inimical connotation, in that it's not criticizing it as a bad work, but instead it's being a very careful reading from a very specific approach. A literary criticism of the Bible is trying to look at it as a great piece of literature, which it is, and identifying the various genres that are in there, the poetry, the narrative stories, the letters, etc., and trying to figure out how they're using what in the stories to drive the story. They're not necessarily interested in the historical fact or fiction of the stories. That's not their concern. That's a whole different type of reading. One of our interesting ones is if you're an Egyptologist, you would read the Bible critically as an Egyptologist. So you're looking at it as a secondary source that has a lot to say about Egypt, and you're using it that way. So back to literary. One of the really interesting ways that I have just run across is called folklore literary criticism. Folk tales, as we all know, typically have various types and tropes that they follow. And it's in how they play around with our expectation of these types and tropes that things get really interesting. Think, for example, of, you start a Disney movie and there's a stepmother, you know where things are going to go. But that doesn't mean the movie or the story is bad, but you get set up with something. If you're watching your favorite Disney movie, everybody's happy at the very beginning, then some ominous music plays, concerning the family, the parents are going to die. Think of my kid's favorite movie, as most kids, Frozen. There's the death of the parents. But even though there's a familiarity in a folk tale where you kind of get the idea of where it's going, think again as rom-coms, the romantic comedy that all follow the same formula, but people still keep going to them time and time again. There's a familiarity there that people like, and then there's the nuance of the difference. Why is Frozen so popular? Because at the end, it's not Kristoff kissing Anna, saving her. It's Anna saving Elsa as the act of love. There's the flip of what one is expecting to happen in the story. So a folktale analysis of the Old Testament, what they're going to do is they're going to try to find and identify different tropes, different ways that folktales work, and they're going to see in that there's certain stories in the Bible that really fit in with that. And the example I want to spend a little bit of time on with you guys today is the wonderful meeting someone at a well to get married. If you start to go through, especially Genesis, you're going to find time and time again that the matchmaking site is meeting at the well. And so people back then, when they're listening to these oral stories being told around the campfire, because that's how they all started, as these oral traditions that eventually got written down, as you're sitting back and you're listening and you hear that Jacob now approaches the well and he meets Rachel, all of a sudden you're going to go, oh, I know where this is going. Okay, how is this going to be played with? And with that nuance in the story, you're going to figure out some things about Jacob. Abraham sends a servant to find a spouse for Isaac. Isaac doesn't go. So everybody kind of recognizes, oh, this is the meeting at the well, just like Jacob, just like Moses. But now it's a servant who's doing it. I apologize for that dinging. I'm trying my best. But now it's a servant going and not Isaac. And that seems to be indicative of Isaac himself. If you then start to look at Isaac, you realize he's a very stationary, passive character. He never seems to leave his tent. It's everybody else who's doing stuff around him. And then you start to wonder, well, maybe the poor guy was traumatized. He was almost sacrificed by his father. Moving on. You have Saul, the first king of Israel. He goes to a well. There's women waiting at the well. You're sitting around the campfire. You go, I know where this is going. But what happens with Saul? Saul doesn't meet his wife. He's looking for some lost donkeys, and he leaves the well, still looking for donkeys, and then eventually looking for a seer who's going to get him in touch with the ghost of Samuel. There's the twist. There's what's going on. It goes all the way further down to Jesus. Jesus goes to the well. Okay? This is Jesus' tradition. He's Jewish. And so when people hear Jesus goes and he meets a woman at the well, they kind of go, oh, well, where is this going? This is interesting. And what happens? Jesus ends up being the one who offers water, living water. And there it is. There's the twist. And there's people going, oh, now, isn't that interesting? And they're going to remember that story, and they're going to learn a lot about Jesus. So it's not the question of whether or not it happened. What's it tell you about the characters in the stories? So that's folktale analysis, and it's really a fascinating thing. I'm going to approach the majority of the books when I do talk about the Bible in this podcast. I'm going to be looking at them as individual books. Yes, they're part of a greater whole, but I'm not going to try to understand what Mark is doing in his work by looking at what Luke is doing. It's nice to contrast, but they're not exactly interpretive of each other. And when you start to do that, and you kind of pull them apart, and you look at 1 John just as 1 John, and not a reference to everything else, things get pretty interesting. If you look at the book of Revelation, and I'll try to do Revelation in 10 minutes. Good luck. And you try to just understand the book of Revelation for what it is, being written by this John of Patmos, well, that's kind of interesting. And you start to realize, some of the other apocalyptic stuff that's in the New Testament, you just leave that alone and try to understand the book of Revelation just as the book of Revelation. What is John the seer trying to communicate in that book? That's, I think, going to get a lot more clear tomorrow when I come back and I talk about the Christmas stories and what happens in the Christmas stories in the 4 different Gospels. And I think you're going to be kind of surprised to hear what we have to say. All right, guys, take care. Be safe. Be your brother's keeper.